The thundering of hooves echoed through the darkness as Mabel Lawson raced across the open plains, her heart pounding in rhythm with her stolen horse. Blood trickled down her arm from where the bullet had grazed her, but she couldn't stop, not if she wanted to live to see tomorrow. Behind her, the angry shouts of men and occasional gunshots drove her deeper into the unknown territory of Montana Territory, 1878. The moon slipped behind heavy clouds, plunging the landscape into near-complete darkness. Rain began to fall, first as scattered drops, then as a torrent that plastered Mabel's hair to her face and soaked through her threadbare dress. Through the curtain of rain, she spotted a light faint but unmistakable and steered her exhausted mount toward it. As she drew closer, the silhouette of a barn materialized against the stormy sky. Without hesitation, Mabel guided her horse inside, dismounting in a stumble of exhaustion and pain. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and livestock. She hastily led her horse to the back corner, hoping to hide them both before whoever owned this place discovered her presence. The creak of the barn door sent panic surging through her veins. Mabel crouched lower behind a stack of hay bales, one hand pressed against her bleeding arm, the other clutching the small pistol she'd taken from her last employer. "I know you're in here," a deep voice called out. "I saw someone ride in." Mabel remained silent, weighing her options. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft glow of a lantern. "I'm not looking for trouble," the voice continued, "but this is my property and I'd like to know who's hiding in my barn." The man stepped into view, holding the lantern high. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh Montana sun. Dark hair fell across his forehead from beneath a well-worn cowboy hat, and his eyes, a piercing blue even in the dim light, scanned the shadows. "Please," Mabel whispered, her voice breaking. "They'll kill me if they find me." The man's gaze snapped to her hiding place, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, he lowered the lantern. "Who's after you?" he asked, his tone softening slightly. "Men from Dawson's mining camp," she replied, wincing as she shifted her position. "I need to hide just for tonight. I'll be gone by morning." The cowboy studied her for what felt like an eternity before nodding once. "No one will find you here," he said. "Not in this storm, not on my land." Relief washed over Mabel, but it was short-lived as darkness began to creep into the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered was the concerned face of the stranger as he rushed toward her collapsing form. When Mabel opened her eyes, daylight filtered through unfamiliar curtains. She was lying on a bed in a small but tidy room. Her arm had been bandaged, and her dirty, wet clothes had been replaced with a man's shirt that swallowed her slender frame. "You're awake," the same deep voice from the barn observed. Mabel sat up quickly, wincing at the pain the movement caused. The cowboy stood in the doorway, a steaming mug in his hand. "Who undressed me?" she demanded, pulling the quilt higher. "Mrs. Peterson from the neighboring farm," he replied calmly. "I rode over to get her help after you fainted. I'm Daniel Weston, by the way." "Mabel," she offered cautiously. "Mabel Lawson." Daniel nodded, crossing the room to set the mug on the bedside table. "Coffee, you look like you could use it, and some answers about who you are and why men with guns are hunting you would be appreciated." Mabel's fingers curled around the warm mug. "It's complicated." "I've got time," Daniel said, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "And you're not going anywhere with that arm until it heals a bit more." Mabel took a sip of coffee, the bitter warmth spreading through her chest. "I was working as a housekeeper for Edgar Dawson at his mining camp." Daniel's expression hardened. "Dawson, he's got a reputation even out here." "Yes, well, his reputation is well-deserved," Mabel said bitterly. "He expected more than housekeeping from the women who worked for him. When I refused, he locked me in my room, said he'd break me eventually." She shuddered at the memory. 2 nights ago, I managed to unlock the door. I was trying to escape when I overheard him talking with some men about a plan to rob the bank in Sacramento. "That's over 50 miles from here," Daniel commented. "I know, I've been riding for 2 days." "When they caught me listening, Dawson ordered his men to kill me. I grabbed a pistol and ran. One of them shot at me as I was stealing a horse." Mabel's hand drifted to her bandaged arm. "I can't go to the sheriff. Dawson has too many men in his pocket." Daniel leaned back in his chair, considering her story. "So you're on the run from a mining baron and his thugs, carrying knowledge that could put them all in prison." "Yes," Mabel admitted, And I've dragged you into it by hiding in your barn. I should leave." "No," Daniel said firmly. "You'd never make it in your condition. Besides, no one knows you're here. My ranch is isolated enough that we rarely get visitors. You can stay until you're healed and we figure out what to do." Mabel studied him, searching for deceit in his eyes and finding none. "Why would you help me?" "You don't know me." A shadow of something pain perhaps crossed Daniel's face. "Let's just say I understand what it's like to be hunted and alone." He stood abruptly. "Rest, I'll bring you some food later." As he reached the door, Mabel called after him, "Thank you, Mr. Weston." He paused, glancing back with the ghost of a smile. Daniel, just Daniel. Over the next few days, Mabel regained her strength. Daniel proved to be a man of few words but considerable kindness. He brought her meals, changed her bandages, and gave her space to recover. Through their brief conversations, she learned he had been running the ranch alone for the past 5 years after returning from fighting in the war. On the 4th day, Mabel felt strong enough to leave the bedroom. She found Daniel in the kitchen, cooking breakfast. He looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "You should be resting," he said, but there was no sternness in his tone. "I've rested enough," Mabel replied, easing herself into a chair at the small wooden table. "I want to be useful. You've done so much for me." Daniel placed a plate of eggs and bacon before her. "Eat first, then we can talk about what happens next." As they ate, Mabel noticed how Daniel's eyes would occasionally drift to the window, scanning the horizon. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked. "Just being cautious," he replied. "There's been no sign of anyone looking for you, but it pays to stay alert." After breakfast, Daniel showed Mabel around the ranch. It was modest but well-maintained, a main house, the barn where she'd first sought refuge, a small vegetable garden, and pastures where cattle grazed. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow even in late spring. "It's beautiful here," Mabel observed as they walked back toward the house. "It's peaceful," Daniel agreed. "That's why I chose it. After the war, I needed somewhere quiet." "Were you in many battles?" Mabel asked, curious about this taciturn man who had saved her life. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Too many. I was with the 7th Cavalry." Mabel didn't press further, recognizing the pain behind his words. Instead, she changed the subject. "I can help around the house while I'm here. Cooking, cleaning, it's the least I can do." "If you feel up to it," Daniel conceded, "but don't push yourself. That wound needs time." As days turned into a week, Mabel fell into a routine on the ranch. She cooked meals, tended the garden, and even learned to feed the animals. Her arm healed slowly but steadily, and with each passing day she felt more at home in this quiet corner of Montana. Daniel, too, seemed to relax in her presence. He spoke more freely, occasionally even laughing at Mabel's observations about ranch life. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Daniel finally shared more of his story. "I wasn't always alone out here," he said, his voice low. "My wife, Sarah, and our son, Thomas, lived here with me when I first bought this land. While I was away fighting, influenza swept through the area by the time I returned." His words trailed off. Mabel reached out impulsively, covering his hand with hers. "I'm so sorry, Daniel," he nodded, turning his hand to briefly squeeze hers before letting go. "It was a long time ago." 7 years now. "Is that why you live so far from town?" Mabel asked gently. "Partly," Daniel admitted. "After losing them, being around people was difficult, and there were other complications from the war, men I'd fought with and against. It seemed simpler to stay away." As darkness fell around them, Mabel found herself sharing her own past, growing up in an orphanage in St. Louis, working as a seamstress until the shop closed, then taking a stagecoach west in search of opportunity. Her journey had led her to Dawson's mining camp, where promises of good pay had quickly turned into a nightmare. "I sometimes wonder if I should have stayed in St. Louis," she mused. "At least there, I knew the dangers." Daniel's eyes reflected the first stars appearing in the night sky. "The West isn't just danger, Mabel. There's freedom here too, a chance to build something of your own away from the constraints of society." "Is that what you've found? Freedom?" He considered her question thoughtfully. "Not exactly, but peace perhaps. Most days, that's enough." The next morning, Mabel woke to the sound of horses approaching the ranch. Heart racing, she peered through the curtains to see 3 riders coming down the path toward the house. Daniel was already outside, rifle in hand but held casually at his side. Mabel hastily dressed, wincing as she pulled on the shirt Daniel had given her to replace her ruined dress. She could hear voices outside but couldn't make out the words. Moving silently to the kitchen, she took the pistol Daniel kept hidden in a flour jar and positioned herself near the window, ready to run or fight if necessary. The door opened, and Daniel entered alone, his expression grim. "Riders from town," he explained. "They're looking for a woman who fled from Dawson's camp. They're offering a reward for information." Fear clutched at Mabel's throat. "Did they describe me?" "Brown hair, slender build, early 20s, Daniel confirmed. "They said she stole money and a horse before shooting one of Dawson's men." "That's a lie," Mabel protested. "I never shot anyone. I took the pistol for protection, but I never fired it." Daniel held up a hand to calm her. "I know, I believe you. I told them I haven't seen anyone fitting that description." "Did they believe you?" Daniel's mouth set in a hard line. "I doubt it. They asked to search the property." Mabel's eyes widened in alarm. "And I refused, told them to come back with the sheriff if they wanted to trespass on my land." Daniel moved to the window, scanning the yard. "They're leaving, but they'll be back, probably with more men." "I need to go," Mabel said, setting the pistol on the table with trembling hands. "I can't bring this trouble to your door." "And go where?" Daniel challenged. "If Dawson's men are watching the roads, you won't make it 10 miles. And now they're claiming you shot someone. They'll hang you without a trial if they catch you." Tears of frustration welled in Mabel's eyes. "Then what do we do?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, thinking. "We need evidence against Dawson, something to take to the federal marshal, not the local sheriff. If we can prove he's planning to rob the bank in Sacramento, that would be enough to bring him down. But how? All I have is what I overheard. It's my word against his." A determined look crossed Daniel's face. "Then we need more than words. We need to find out when this robbery is happening and catch them in the act." Mabel stared at him in disbelief. "You're suggesting we go after Dawson ourselves? That's madness." "Not after him," Daniel corrected. "We just need to get to Sacramento before he does. I have a friend there, Matthew Reed. He was in my unit during the war and now works as a deputy. If anyone will believe us, it's him." "Sacramento is days away," Mabel pointed out, "and Dawson's men are looking for me." "Which is why we'll leave tonight," Daniel said decisively. "I know trails through the mountains that Dawson's men won't. We can be in Sacramento in 3 days if we push hard." Mabel considered his words, the reality of their situation settling heavily on her shoulders. "You do that? Risk your life, your home, for someone you barely know?" Daniel met her gaze steadily. "You're not just someone, Mabel, not anymore." The simple statement sent an unexpected warmth through Mabel's chest, a feeling she quickly tried to suppress. Attachment was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when her life hung by such a tenuous thread. "All right," she agreed finally. "We'll leave tonight." As darkness fell, Daniel and Mabel prepared for their journey. He packed provisions, ammunition, and extra clothing while Mabel helped saddle the horses. Her arm still ached, but she pushed through the discomfort, knowing far worse awaited if Dawson's men caught up to them. "Take this," Daniel said, handing her a dark wool coat that had belonged to his wife. "The nights are cold in the mountains, and that shirt won't keep you warm." Mabel slipped on the coat, which smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. "Thank you," she said softly, touched by the significance of the gesture. They set out under a moonless sky, Daniel leading them away from the main trails and into the foothills. Mabel struggled to keep up, her riding skills limited to the basic knowledge she'd gained fleeing from Dawson's camp. Daniel noticed her discomfort and slowed their pace, occasionally reaching over to adjust her posture or grip on the reins. "You're doing fine," he encouraged as they navigated a particularly steep section. "Just trust the horse. She knows these trails better than you do." By dawn, they had climbed high enough to look back over the valley. Daniel's ranch was a tiny speck in the distance, and beyond it, a plume of smoke rose into the sky. "Daniel," Mabel said, pointing. "Is that?" His face hardened as he followed her gaze. "They're burning my ranch." Mabel's hand flew to her mouth in horror. "Oh, Daniel, I'm so sorry. This is my fault." "No," he said firmly. "This is Dawson's doing, and he'll pay for it." He turned his horse away from the view. "We need to keep moving. They'll be tracking us once they realize we're gone." They pushed on through the day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat a cold meal. By nightfall, they had reached a small plateau sheltered by towering pines. "We'll camp here," Daniel decided. The trees will hide our fire and there's water nearby. As Mabel gathered wood for the fire, she couldn't shake the image of Daniel's ranch burning. Everything he had built, all that remained of his life with his family gone because of her. She fought back tears as she arranged the kindling. "It's not your fault," Daniel said quietly, startling her. He had approached silently, a skill Mabel had noticed he possessed. "How did you know what I was thinking?" she asked, blinking rapidly to clear her eyes. Daniel crouched beside her, taking the flint from her hands to strike a spark. "Because I know guilt when I see it. I carried it for years after Sarah and Thomas died, wondering if I could have saved them if I'd been home instead of fighting a war." "That's different," Mabel argued. "You were serving your country. I brought danger directly to your door." The fire caught, flames licking at the dry wood. Daniel's face was illuminated in the golden light as he looked at her. "You were fighting for your life, Mabel. There's no shame in that. Besides, a ranch can be rebuilt. A life cannot be replaced." His words, spoken with such conviction, eased something in Mabel's chest. She helped him prepare a simple supper of jerky and hardtack, and they ate in comfortable silence as the stars appeared overhead. "Tell me about your life before St. Louis," Daniel said as they finished their meal. "You mentioned an orphanage, but what about before that?" Mabel poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the night air. "There isn't much to tell. My mother died when I was 6 consumption. My father tried to keep us together, but he was killed in an accident at the factory where he worked when I was 8. No relatives wanted to take me in, so the orphanage it was. That must have been hard growing up without family." "It was lonely," Mabel admitted, "but I learned to be self-reliant. The nuns taught us practical skills: cooking, sewing, basic arithmetic. They meant well, preparing us for lives of service." "Is that what you want, a life of service?" Daniel asked, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Mabel considered the question. "No," she said finally. "What I want is a place of my own. Somewhere I can make decisions about my own life without answering to anyone else." Daniel nodded, understanding in his expression. "Freedom?" "Yes," Mabel agreed. "Freedom." They settled down to sleep, Daniel insisting Mabel take the only blanket while he kept watch. Despite her protests, exhaustion soon pulled her into slumber, the sound of Daniel cleaning his rifle the last thing she heard. She woke suddenly, hours later, to Daniel's hand over her mouth and his voice low and urgent in her ear. "Riders, at least 4 of them. They've found our trail." Mabel's heart hammered against her ribs as she nodded her understanding. Daniel removed his hand and they quickly packed their meager camp, extinguishing the fire and scattering the ashes. "They're coming up the eastern path," Daniel whispered, helping Mabel onto her horse. "We'll head west toward the river. If we can cross it, the water will hide our tracks." They rode in tense silence, the sound of distant hoofbeats spurring them to greater speed. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as they descended toward the river, forcing them to slow despite the danger behind them. Dawn was breaking as they reached the riverbank, the water running swift and high with spring snowmelt. "Can we cross here?" Mabel asked, eyeing the churning current doubtfully. Daniel studied the river, his expression grim. "We have to, they're too close." He pointed to a section where the water seemed slightly calmer. "There, stay close to me, and if you fall, let go of the reins. The horse will find its way across." Mabel swallowed her fear and nodded. Daniel urged his mount into the water and she followed. The current was stronger than it looked, pushing against the horses with frightening force. Halfway across, Mabel's horse stumbled on a submerged rock, nearly throwing her into the rushing water. She cried out, clutching the animal's mane as it struggled to regain its footing. Daniel turned at her cry, his face stark with concern. He guided his horse back toward her, reaching out to grasp her reins and steady the panicked animal. "Easy," he called over the roar of the water. "You're doing fine, just a little further." With Daniel's help, they made it to the opposite bank, both horses and riders drenched and shivering in the cool morning air. They didn't have time to rest, though, as shouts from the far bank indicated their pursuers had arrived. "Into the trees," Daniel directed, leading them into a dense forest that bordered the river. They had barely disappeared into the cover of the pines when gunshots rang out, bullets splintering bark around them. "Keep riding," Daniel shouted, drawing his rifle and turning to return fire. Mabel hesitated, unwilling to leave him behind. "Go," he insisted, firing again. I'll catch up. Heart in her throat, Mabel pressed on, guiding her horse deeper into the forest. The sound of gunfire continued behind her, punctuated by shouts and the crack of breaking branches. Then suddenly, silence fell. Mabel reined in her mount, listening intently. Had Daniel been shot? Should she go back? Before she could decide, hoofbeats approached rapidly. She reached for her pistol, ready to defend herself, when Daniel burst through the trees, his face streaked with blood from a cut above his eyebrow. "They're crossing the river," he reported breathlessly. "We need to move." "You're hurt," Mabel said, reaching toward his face. "It's nothing," he dismissed. "Just a graze from a tree branch. Come on." They rode hard through the forest, following game trails that twisted and wound through the dense undergrowth. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and their pursuers, but Daniel refused to slow their pace. "We need to reach the old mining road before nightfall," he explained. "From there, it's a straight shot to Sacramento. We can make better time, and there might be other travelers for safety." As the sun began its descent, they emerged from the forest onto a crude road carved into the mountainside. It was little more than a wide path in places, but it was clearly used regularly by wagons and riders. "We'll rest here briefly," Daniel decided, helping Mabel dismount. "The horses need water and we should eat something." Mabel's legs trembled with exhaustion as she stood, and she leaned against her horse for support. Daniel noticed immediately concern etching lines around his eyes. "Your arm is bleeding again," he observed, gently taking her hand to examine the reopened wound. "We need to clean and rebandage it." Using water from his canteen and a clean strip of cloth torn from his shirt, Daniel carefully tended to Mabel's injury. His touch was gentle but confident, and Mabel found herself studying his face as he worked. The past week had changed him, or perhaps just her perception of him. The stern, solitary rancher had revealed layers of compassion, courage, and unexpected tenderness. "Thank you," she said softly as he tied off the bandage. Daniel looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of the bond that had formed in their shared danger and trust. The moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Daniel's head snapped up, his body tensing. "Back on the horses," he ordered, helping Mabel mount despite her protests that she could manage alone. "We're too exposed here." They continued along the mining road, pushing the tired horses as much as they dared on the treacherous path. As darkness fell, lights appeared in the distance, a small settlement nestled in a valley below. "Kingston," Daniel identified the cluster of buildings. "It's a mining town." "Not much there, but they have a stable and an inn." "Is it safe?" Mabel asked, wary of stopping anywhere they might be recognized. Daniel considered the question. "Safer than sleeping in the open with Dawson's men on our trail. We need rest, and so do the horses. We'll leave before first light." The town was indeed small, a single street lined with basic establishments. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and the promised inn. A few miners lingered outside the saloon, but otherwise, the street was quiet as Daniel and Mabel rode in. They stopped at the stable first, arranging care for their exhausted mounts. Daniel paid the stable boy extra to feed and groom the animals, ensuring they would be ready for an early departure. At the inn, a weathered woman with sharp eyes greeted them with suspicion. "Don't get many travelers this time of year," she remarked, looking them up and down, "especially not looking like you two, all wet and trail-worn." "We had to cross the river," Daniel explained smoothly. "Taking a shortcut to Sacramento. My sister and I are headed to our uncle's funeral." The woman's expression softened slightly at the mention of a funeral. "Sorry for your loss. I've got one room available, 2 beds. $5 for the night, includes hot water for washing and breakfast before dawn if you need it." "We'll take it," Daniel said, counting out the money. The room was small but clean, with 2 narrow beds, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the street. Mabel sank onto one of the beds, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to her. "Your sister?" she questioned with a faint smile as Daniel checked that the window was securely latched. He shrugged. "Seemed simpler than the truth. People remember unusual stories." He gestured to the washstand. "You should clean up first, I'll keep watch." Mabel didn't argue, grateful for the opportunity to wash away the dirt and sweat of their journey. The hot water was a luxury after days on the trail, and she took her time despite her fatigue, washing her hair and face and changing into the clean shirt Daniel had packed for her. When she emerged from behind the privacy screen, Daniel was standing by the window, peering out at the darkened street. "Any sign of trouble?" she asked, combing her damp hair with her fingers. "Not yet," he replied, turning to face her. His expression softened as he took in her cleaner appearance. "You look better." "I feel better," Mabel admitted. "It's amazing what hot water can do," she gestured to the washstand. "Your turn," Daniel hesitated. "I should keep watch." "Daniel," Mabel interrupted gently. "You've been taking care of me for days. Take care of yourself for a few minutes. I can watch the street." After a moment's consideration, he nodded and moved to the washstand while Mabel took his place at the window. The town was quiet, most buildings dark except for the saloon, which still spilled light and raucous laughter into the street. When Daniel finished washing, he looked remarkably different, the trail dust gone from his face and hair. The lines of tension around his eyes slightly eased. He sat on the edge of his bed, checking his pistol before placing it within easy reach. "We should get some sleep," he suggested. "If we leave before dawn, we can reach Sacramento by nightfall tomorrow." Mabel nodded, settling onto her own bed. "Daniel," she said hesitantly, "what will you do?" "After this is over, I mean." He was quiet for so long that Mabel thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed. "I don't know, rebuild, I suppose, if there's anything left to salvage." "I'm sorry about your ranch," Mabel said again, the guilt resurging. "It's just land and buildings," Daniel replied, though his tone suggested he felt the loss more deeply than his words indicated. "What about you? What will you do if we succeed in bringing Dawson down?" It was Mabel's turn to consider. "I'm not sure, find work somewhere, I guess. Save enough to buy a little place of my own someday." Daniel looked at her across the small room, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You could," he began, then stopped himself. "We should sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day." Mabel wanted to press him, to ask what he had been about to suggest, but exhaustion was already pulling at her consciousness. She murmured a good night and was asleep within minutes. A hand over her mouth jolted Mabel awake in the pre-dawn darkness. Daniel's face was inches from hers, his finger pressed to his lips in warning. He removed his hand slowly and whispered, "Riders, at least 6 of them, they're checking the stable." Mabel's heart began to race. "How did they find us?" "Doesn't matter," Daniel replied, already gathering their few belongings. "We need to leave. Now." They moved silently, Daniel leading Mabel to the window rather than the door. He eased it open and peered out. "There's a roof below. We can climb down to the alley." "What about the horses?" Mabel asked as she followed him onto the sloped roof of the inn's kitchen. "We'll have to leave them," Daniel said grimly. "We can't risk the stable." They made their way carefully across the roof and down to the alley behind the inn. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, providing enough visibility to navigate the narrow space between buildings. "This way," Daniel directed, leading her toward the edge of town. "There's a trail that follows the creek. It's longer than the main road, but it'll keep us out of sight." They had almost reached the trail when a shout rang out behind them. "There they are! Run!" Daniel urged, pushing Mabel ahead of him as gunfire erupted. They sprinted for the cover of the trees, bullets kicking up dirt around their feet. Just as they reached the tree line, Mabel heard Daniel grunt in pain. She turned to see him stumble, his hand pressed to his side. "Daniel," she cried, rushing back to help him. "I'm all right," he insisted through gritted teeth. "Keep moving." Blood was seeping through his fingers, but he remained upright, pushing forward into the dense undergrowth. Mabel wrapped an arm around his waist, supporting him as they hurried along the barely visible trail that paralleled the creek. The sounds of pursuit faded as they moved deeper into the forest, but Daniel's breathing grew increasingly labored. After nearly an hour of difficult progress, he finally admitted he needed to rest. "Just for a minute," he gasped, sinking down against a fallen tree. Mabel knelt beside him, gently moving his hand away from the wound. The bullet had grazed his side, tearing a path through flesh but not lodging in his body. "It's not as bad as it could be," she assessed, tearing strips from her petticoat to create a bandage, "but it's still bleeding a lot." Daniel winced as she cleaned the wound with water from the creek. "We can't stay here long, they'll be tracking us." "You can't keep going like this," Mabel argued. "You'll bleed to death." "We don't have a choice," Daniel replied, his face pale but determined. If we don't reach Sacramento and warn them about the robbery, Dawson wins, and we both end up dead anyway. Mabel knew he was right, but fear for his life made her hesitant. At least let me bind it properly before we continue. Daniel nodded, leaning back to give her better access to the wound. As Mabel worked, her fingers gentle against his skin, he watched her face, the concentration in her eyes, the firm set of her mouth, the strand of hair that had escaped her hasty braid. "You would have made a good doctor," he commented, trying to distract himself from the pain. Mabel smiled faintly. "I wanted to be one once, read every medical book I could find at the orphanage, but women aren't allowed in medical school." "The world's loss," Daniel said sincerely. She finished bandaging him and helped him to his feet. "Can you walk?" "I can do more than walk," he assured her, though his complexion suggested otherwise. "We need to keep moving." They continued along the creek trail, their pace slower but steady. By midday, they had reached a point where the creek joined a larger river, the American River. Daniel identified it, which would lead them directly to Sacramento. "We're close," he encouraged Mabel, whose own exhaustion was beginning to show. "Maybe 8 more hours on foot." 8 hours seemed insurmountable in their condition, but they pushed on, stopping only briefly to eat the last of their provisions and drink from the river. Daniel's wound had stopped bleeding, but fever was beginning to set in, his skin hot to the touch despite the cool spring air. As the sun began to set, the outskirts of Sacramento finally came into view, scattered farms and homesteads giving way to more densely packed buildings. Daniel, now leaning heavily on Mabel, directed them toward the eastern part of the city. "Matthew lives near the courthouse," he explained, his voice weak. "Just a few more streets." The modest house Daniel led them to was set back from the road with a small garden out front. A tall man with graying hair answered their knock, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol at his hip until recognition dawned on his face. "Daniel," he exclaimed, taking in their bedraggled appearance. "Good God, man, what happened to you?" "Hello, Matthew," Daniel managed before his knees buckled. Matthew caught him before he could fall, calling over his shoulder, "Rebecca. Come quickly, it's Daniel Weston and he's hurt." A woman appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm as she took in the scene. "Bring him inside, quickly. The spare bedroom is ready." Between them, Matthew and Mabel carried Daniel to a small but comfortable bedroom where Rebecca immediately began removing his bloodied shirt to examine the wound. "It's a bullet graze," Mabel explained, hovering anxiously. "It happened early this morning. He's been walking all day." Rebecca glanced up at her, assessing. "You bound this?" "Yes, madam. Good work," the older woman acknowledged. "It's clean, no signs of serious infection yet, but he's running a fever that needs to be brought down." She turned to her husband. "Matthew, fetch my medicine box and boil some water, and find something for this young lady to eat. She looks ready to collapse herself." Despite her protests that she was fine, Mabel soon found herself seated at the Reed's kitchen table, a bowl of stew before her and a cup of strong tea in her hands. Matthew sat across from her, his deputy's badge glinting in the lamplight. "Now," he said once she had eaten enough to restore some color to her face, "suppose you tell me what brings you and Daniel to my doorstep, both of you looking half dead and him with a bullet wound." Mabel explained everything: her escape from Dawson's camp, finding refuge with Daniel, the overheard plans for the bank robbery, and their harrowing journey to Sacramento. Matthew listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, stroking his mustache thoughtfully. "Dawson's a powerful man," he observed. "He's got friends in high places, including some in law enforcement, but bank robbery is a federal offense. If we can catch him in the act, not even his connections can save him." "Do you know when they're planning to rob the bank?" Mabel asked urgently. Matthew shook his head. "No, but there's one thing that might give us a clue. The Sacramento bank is transferring a large shipment of gold to San Francisco the day after tomorrow. It's not public knowledge, but someone in Dawson's position might have heard about it." "That must be it," Mabel agreed. "It fits with what I overheard. They were talking about a shipment." "Then we have tomorrow to prepare," Matthew said decisively. "I'll speak with the marshal first thing in the morning. In the meantime, you need rest as much as Daniel does." Rebecca appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's sleeping now." I've cleaned the wound properly and given him something for the fever. He should be better by morning, but he won't be chasing any bank robbers for a few days." "Thank you," Mabel said sincerely. "For everything." Rebecca smiled warmly. "Any friend of Daniel's is welcome here. I've prepared the other spare room for you. Come, you look dead on your feet." The next morning, Mabel woke to sunlight streaming through curtained windows. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, panic rising in her throat until the events of the previous day came flooding back. She dressed quickly in clothes Rebecca had left for her, a simple blue dress that was slightly too large but clean and whole. She found Daniel awake in the other bedroom, propped up on pillows, his color much improved though he still looked weak. "You should be resting," she admonished, taking a seat in the chair beside his bed. "So should you," he countered with a shadow of his usual dry humor. "But here we both are, awake at dawn." Mabel smiled, relief washing over her at seeing him alert. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," Daniel admitted. "But better than yesterday. Rebecca knows her medicine." He studied Mabel's face. "You spoke with Matthew?" "Yes. He thinks the robbery will happen tomorrow when the bank is transferring gold to San Francisco. He's meeting with the marshal this morning." Daniel attempted to sit up straighter, wincing with the effort. "I should be there. Matthew's a good man, but he doesn't know Dawson like we do." "You're not going anywhere," Mabel said firmly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Matthew is a deputy marshal. He knows how to handle this." Before Daniel could argue further, Matthew himself appeared in the doorway. "Good to see you awake, old friend. You gave us quite a scare." "Takes more than a bullet to keep me down," Daniel replied. "What did the marshal say?" Matthew's expression was grimly satisfied. "He believes us. Apparently there have been rumors about Dawson's operations for some time, but no solid evidence. This is the chance they've been waiting for." He looked at Mabel. "He wants to speak with you, Miss Lawson, to hear your account firsthand." Mabel nodded, though anxiety fluttered in her stomach at the thought of facing a federal marshal. "Of course, when?" "As soon as you're ready," Matthew replied. "He's waiting at his office." Daniel reached for Mabel's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Tell him everything exactly as it happened. The marshal is a fair man, he'll listen." Mabel squeezed his hand in return, drawing strength from his confidence in her. "I will." Marshal James Cooper was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and piercing hazel eyes that seemed to look straight through Mabel as she recounted her story. He asked few questions, but listened intently, making occasional notes on the paper before him. When she finished, he set down his pencil and leaned back in his chair. "Miss Lawson, do you understand the seriousness of these accusations? Edgar Dawson is one of the wealthiest men in the territory with powerful friends." "I understand, sir," Mabel replied steadily. "But everything I've told you is the truth. Daniel Weston was shot trying to bring this information to you. We both nearly died to prevent this robbery." The marshal studied her for a long moment before nodding once. "I believe you, and we're going to set a trap for Mr. Dawson and his men." He outlined his plan. Allow the robbery to begin, but have deputies and soldiers stationed throughout the bank and surrounding buildings. Once Dawson and his men were inside, they would spring the trap. "It's risky," Matthew commented. "If they realize it's a setup, they could start shooting. Innocent people might get hurt. That's why we'll clear the bank of all civilians beforehand," Cooper explained. "The only people inside will be my men, disguised as bank employees and customers." Mabel listened to the details of the plan with growing hope. For the first time since fleeing Dawson's camp, she could see a future where she might truly be free of his threat. When they returned to the Reeds' house, Daniel was sitting in the parlor, looking pale but determined. His eyes sought Mabel's immediately. "How did it go?" She explained the marshal's plan as Matthew poured them all coffee. Daniel listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "It could work," he acknowledged when she finished. "But Dawson is cunning. He'll have lookouts, escape routes planned." "The marshals thought of that," Matthew assured him. "We're covering all approaches to the bank and we'll have men watching for lookouts. This isn't his first bank robbery case." Daniel still looked concerned. "I should be there. I know how these men think." "You can barely stand," Mabel objected. "You'd be a liability, not an asset." Daniel's jaw tightened at her blunt assessment, but he didn't argue. Instead, he asked, "And what about you? What will you do during all this?" "Stay here with Rebecca," Mabel replied. The marshal was very clear about that. I'm a witness, not a deputy. Daniel seemed relieved by this, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Good. You've been in enough danger already. That evening, as Matthew prepared to leave for a final planning meeting with the marshal, Mabel found herself alone with Daniel in the parlor. Rebecca had retired early, exhausted from tending to their unexpected guests. "Are you afraid?" Daniel asked quietly as they sat before the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across their faces. Mabel considered the question seriously. "Yes," she admitted, "but not as much as I was. For the first time, I feel like there might be an end to this nightmare." Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I felt the same way after the war, like I might never escape the shadow of what happened, but eventually you find your way back to the light." "Is that what happened when you built your ranch?" Mabel asked, curious about the life he had created for himself. A faint smile touched Daniel's lips. "In a way, the work helped, having something to build, to nurture. The quiet helped too after years of chaos and noise." His expression sobered. "But it was lonely, more so than I expected." The admission hung in the air between them, charged with unspoken meaning. Mabel found herself studying his face, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his right eyebrow, the way the firelight softened the usual intensity of his blue eyes. "It doesn't have to be lonely," she said softly, the words escaping before she could consider their implications. Daniel looked at her sharply, something like hope flickering across his features before he mastered it. "Mabel, when this is over, you'll have choices, opportunities. You shouldn't feel obligated to. It's not obligation," she interrupted, suddenly certain of what she wanted to say. "These past 2 weeks have been terrifying and dangerous, but they've also shown me things about myself and about you that I might never have discovered otherwise." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. "What things?" Mabel took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "That I'm stronger than I knew, that I can trust my instincts, that sometimes the most unexpected circumstances can lead to the most important connections." She hesitated before adding, "that I've come to care for you, Daniel. More than I should, perhaps, given how little time we've known each other." For a long moment, Daniel was silent, and Mabel feared she had misread everything, embarrassment heating her cheeks. Then, slowly, he reached across the space between them and took her hand. "Time is a poor measure of some things," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I've known men for years and never trusted them as I trust you after 2 weeks. I've lived in communities where I felt more alone than I do when I'm with you." His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I care for you too, Mabel, more than I thought possible again." The confession hung between them, fragile and precious. Mabel was acutely aware of the warmth of his hand around hers, the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed, the intensity in his eyes that made her heart race. "What happens tomorrow?" she whispered, afraid to break the moment but unable to ignore the uncertainty that still shadowed their future. Daniel's expression grew solemn. "Tomorrow, if all goes as planned, Dawson will be arrested and you'll be free of his threat. After that." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "After that, I'll rebuild my ranch. It won't be easy and it will take time, but I know that land. It's good land." "It sounds like a lot of work for one person," Mabel observed, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. A small smile curved Daniel's lips. "It is too much for one person, really." His eyes held hers, a question in their depths. "It would be easier with a partner, someone who understands the value of freedom and building something of one's own." Mabel felt a smile blossoming on her face, hope, and something deeper unfurling in her chest. "That sounds like the kind of opportunity I've been looking for." Daniel's smile widened in response, and he leaned forward, his free hand coming up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. The touch lingered, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Mabel," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, "when this is over, would you consider staying with me, helping me rebuild? It won't be easy and I can't offer much at first," but she silenced him by pressing her fingers gently to his lips. "Yes," she said simply, "I would like that very much." The relief and joy that transformed his face was answer enough, but when he leaned forward to kiss her, his lips meeting hers with gentle passion, Mabel knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world, not in a location. but with this man who had risked everything to protect her. The kiss deepened, Daniel's hand cradling the back of her neck with exquisite care, mindful of his injury even as he drew her closer. Mabel responded with all the emotion that had been building since that first night in his barn, when a stranger had offered shelter and promised that no one would find her there. When they finally parted, both breathless, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he whispered, "know that finding you was worth everything, even my ranch." Mabel laughed softly, joy bubbling up within her. "We'll build it back better than before, together." The day of the bank robbery dawned clear and bright, the spring sun warming the streets of Sacramento as citizens went about their business, unaware of the drama about to unfold. Mabel paced nervously in the Reed's parlor, watching the clock tick slowly toward noon, when the gold shipment was scheduled to leave for San Francisco. Daniel, against doctor's orders and Mabel's protests, had insisted on being present at the bank, though he had compromised by agreeing to remain in the marshal's office across the street rather than participating directly in the operation. "He's too stubborn for his own good," Rebecca commented as she joined Mabel by the window. "Always has been from what Matthew tells me." "You've known Daniel long?" Mabel asked, grateful for the distraction of conversation. Rebecca smiled fondly. "Not personally until now. But Matthew speaks of him often. They served together in the worst of the fighting. Matthew says there wasn't a braver or more loyal soldier in the regiment." This aligned with what Mabel had come to know of Daniel, and she nodded, pride warming her chest. "He saved my life, multiple times." Rebecca studied her face with knowing eyes. "And it seems you've saved something of his as well. Matthew says he hasn't seen Daniel look at anyone that way since Sarah was alive." Mabel blushed, unaccustomed to having her feelings so plainly acknowledged. "We've discussed a future together," she admitted. "After all this is over." "Good," Rebecca said decisively. "That man has been alone too long, and you seem like exactly what he needs, someone with spirit and determination to match his own." Before Mabel could respond, the distant sound of gunfire shattered the peaceful morning. Both women rushed to the window, but they could see nothing from their vantage point. "Stay here," Rebecca instructed, moving to lock the doors. "Matthew made me promise we wouldn't leave the house until he comes for us." The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness, punctuated by occasional bursts of gunfire and shouting. Mabel's imagination conjured terrible scenarios. Daniel shot again, this time fatally, Dawson escaping, innocent people caught in the crossfire. After what felt like hours but was probably less than 45 minutes, the gunfire ceased. The silence that followed was almost more unnerving than the chaos had been. Mabel resumed her pacing, jumping at every sound from the street. Finally, a knock came at the front door. Rebecca approached cautiously, pistol in hand. "Who is it?" "It's me," Matthew's voice called. "It's over." Rebecca unlocked the door to reveal her husband, looking weary but triumphant. Behind him stood Daniel, pale but upright, supported by a young deputy. "Daniel," Mabel rushed forward, relief flooding her at the sight of him alive and relatively unharmed. He reached for her with his free arm, drawing her close. "It worked," he murmured against her hair. "Dawson and 7 of his men are in custody. The marshal has enough evidence to put them away for years." "What happened?" Rebecca asked, helping the deputy guide Daniel to a chair. "We heard gunfire." Matthew sighed heavily, removing his hat. One of Dawson's men spotted a deputy he recognized. They realized it was a trap and tried to shoot their way out. 2 of Dawson's men were killed, and one of our deputies was wounded, but he'll recover. "And Dawson himself?" Mabel asked anxiously. A grim smile crossed Matthew's face. "Caught trying to escape through the bank's back entrance. He's currently enjoying the hospitality of the Sacramento jail, along with his surviving men." The relief that washed over Mabel was so profound she felt her knees weaken. She sank into a chair beside Daniel, who immediately took her hand in his. "It's truly over?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. "It's over," Daniel confirmed, squeezing her hand. "The marshal took your statement, along with evidence found on Dawson and his men. They'll stand trial for attempted bank robbery, and you won't have to testify if you don't want to. There's more than enough evidence without your direct involvement." Mabel closed her eyes briefly, savoring the knowledge that she was finally free from Dawson's threat. When she opened them again, she found Daniel watching her, his expression soft with understanding and something deeper that made her heart skip. "What now?" she asked, though she already knew the answer in her heart. "Now," Daniel said, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand, "we go home, or what's left of it, and we start rebuilding." 2 weeks later, Mabel stood beside Daniel at the crest of a hill overlooking what remained of his ranch. The main house had been reduced to charred timbers and blackened stone, but the barn where she had first sought refuge still stood, damaged but repairable. The pastures stretched out before them, green with spring growth, cattle grazing peacefully as if nothing had changed. "It's still beautiful," she said softly, slipping her hand into his. Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than despairing. "It will be again, better even." He turned to face her fully. "Are you sure about this, Mabel? It won't be easy. We're starting almost from scratch." Mabel's answer was to reach up and pull him down for a kiss, pouring all her certainty into the gesture. When they parted, she smiled up at him. "I've never been more sure of anything. This is where I want to be, with you." The conviction in her voice seemed to settle something in Daniel. He pulled her close, his arms strong and secure around her. "Then let's get started." They began with the barn, making it habitable while they worked on plans for rebuilding the main house. Word of their situation spread through the nearby communities, and help arrived in unexpected forms, neighboring ranchers bringing lumber and supplies. A group of women from the closest town arriving with food and household items. Even Matthew and Rebecca making the journey from Sacramento to help for a week. Through it all, Mabel and Daniel worked side by side, their partnership deepening with each challenge overcome. They were married by a traveling preacher on a warm summer evening, standing amidst the half-built walls of their new home, surrounded by the friends who had helped make it possible. As autumn painted the surrounding mountains in golds and reds, the house was finally completed, different from the original but somehow more fitting, with large windows that let in abundant light and a wide porch where they could watch the sunset together. On the first night in their finished home, Daniel built a fire in the new stone hearth while Mabel prepared a simple but special meal. As they sat before the fire afterward, Daniel pulled her into his lap, his arms encircling her waist. "Happy?" he asked, his voice low and intimate in the quiet room. Mabel leaned back against his chest, savoring the solid warmth of him. "More than I ever imagined possible," she replied honestly. "Though I still can't believe how it all began, me hiding in your barn, half dead from fear and that bullet graze." Daniel pressed a kiss to her temple. "Best thing that ever happened to me, finding you there, even with everything that followed, even losing your original house." Mabel teased gently. "Even that," he confirmed without hesitation. "Buildings can be replaced, what we found together can't be." Mabel turned in his arms to face him, cupping his face in her hands. "I love you, Daniel Weston. Thank you for saying those words that first night. No one will find you here. You gave me safety when I needed it most." Daniel captured her hands in his, pressing kisses to her palms. "And you gave me a reason to rebuild, to look forward rather than back. I love you, Mabel Weston, more than I have words to express." As the fire crackled and night fell around their new home, Mabel knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just safety but belonging, a place and a person with whom she could build a life filled with love, trust, and the freedom they both cherished. 1 year later, as spring once again turned the Montana hills green, Mabel stood on the porch of their home, watching Daniel work with the new foal born just days earlier. Her hand rested on her swelling belly, a smile curving her lips as she observed the gentle way he handled the young animal. So much had changed in the 2 years since she had fled Dawson's camp. The former mining baron was serving 20 years in prison for attempted bank robbery and a host of other crimes that had come to light during his trial. Daniel's ranch, their ranch now, had been fully restored and was thriving, with expanded herds and a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far as California. But the most precious change was the one growing within her, the child who would be born by summer's end. A child who would know only love and security, never the fear and loneliness that had marked both their parents' early lives. Daniel looked up, catching sight of her on the porch. His face broke into a wide smile, the unguarded, joyful expression that never failed to warm Mabel's heart. He patted the foal once more before walking toward the house, removing his hat as he approached. "Everything all right?" he asked, his gaze dropping to her hand on her belly. "Perfect," Mabel assured him, reaching for his hand to place it beside hers. "He's been kicking up a storm today. I think he's going to have his father's restless energy." Daniel's eyes widened as he felt the movement beneath his palm. You sound certain," Mabel smiled mysteriously, "just a feeling. But whether boy or girl, this child will be loved beyond measure." "That's the absolute truth," Daniel agreed, drawing her into his arms for a tender kiss. "And so is his mother." As they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, the future stretching bright before them, Mabel reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her here. A desperate flight, a chance encounter, a barn that offered shelter from more than just a storm. "No one will find you here," Daniel had promised that night. What neither of them could have known was that in hiding from danger, Mabel would find so much more: a home, a partner, a love that had transformed both their lives. And as their child grew within her, Mabel knew with absolute certainty that what had begun in fear had blossomed into something boundlessly beautiful: a life and a love built on trust, courage, and the promise of tomorrow.